here are the titles of our presentations from today. We've had After Narcissism, Toward Congregational and Clergy Humility and Healing. We have had Therapeutic Resources and the Latino-Latina Congregations, Needs, Obstacles, Pastoral Care, and Psychological Referral. We've had 7 transitions, Emerging Adults Experience, and how they want older adults to accompany them, Leading Difficult Conversations, Practices for Effective Small Group Facilitation in Contentious Spaces, and then Revisiting Self-Esteem and its Impact on Human Connection. I just want to highlight a few themes of what I've heard in the presentations I was able to attend, and then we'll kind of open it up to see kind of what's coming up for you all. We have space for people to continue to engage in Q&A online as we've been doing, but we also this time around have 2 microphones available in the room if people want to kind of just get up and ask a question. Note the question, not necessarily a full sermon or comment or that kind of thing, so we can engage in some conversation. A few themes that I've heard as I've been listening kind of throughout the day is the significance of paying attention to the Imago Dei. At least in the presentations that I've attended and been a part of, acknowledging that we are people who have worth and value because we're created in God's image has been a theme that's returned. And we thought about something that Dr. Strawn said earlier today about shame being the underside of narcissism. And that's come up in some of the other presentations. One of our presenters, Dr. Cornell, who's a professor in our School of Mission and Theology, talked about that underlying shame sometimes is what he calls worm theology. Worm theology, this idea that I am nothing, I am worthless, I'm like a worm. And that particular view of the self, that theological view, actually, I think, can plant some seeds that can manifest in some narcissistic ways. It's been intriguing to think about how theologians might talk about some of the roots of what we see as psychologists. I've also found it really helpful to hear from some folks talking about self-esteem in terms of honor. What does it mean to honor myself? And when I am well, I'm actually able to honor other people. If I'm not well, I'm not always able to honor those around me, to give them my best self. I also heard, finally, some themes regarding the importance of paying attention to families and family dynamics and the ways that international patterns and intergenerational patterns of trauma can perpetuate some of these experiences of narcissistic tendencies. I've been super blessed by the panels, and I hope that you all have been as well. There's a little bit of a recap of what I've heard, some themes. Any thoughts for you?
Yes, I was in this room all day. To listen to the presentation on the 7 transitions for emerging adults was wonderful. And I loved how they first connected with narcissism, that sometimes us older folks, when we're frustrated with younger folks, we categorize them as being unduly self-centered or even narcissistic, right? And so the presenters were challenging those concepts and helping us think about really the massive amount of transitions that emerging adults are going through. One of the things that I took away that I thought was really helpful is actually when I had my pastor's hat on, and they were talking about looking at transition moments as windows of mentorship. And the other thing I thought about that was that maybe one of the ways that we have to pastor emerging adults is pastor them loosely. And what I mean by that is expect for them to leave. If you pastor them well, they probably are going to leave, right? Because all the transitions they're going, they may leave to go to another state and take a job. They may get married. They may move. And so sometimes I've noticed that we pastors can get a little clingy, a little adhesive, right? And so we want our people to come and stay forever. But what if you thought about, a transition is a window of mentorship and discipleship. And our job is to help this person transition well, faithfully to the call they have on their life or what they think God wants for them.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. Any themes that you would highlight from you and Amy's presentation that I wasn't able to be at?
I mean, we went back to, again, intellectual humility as being core to being able to enter into complex conversations where there's contentiousness. And we focused a lot, again, on the capacity to self-regulate one's own self. An unsettled body can't settle an unsettled body. So we have to try to figure out as pastors or clinicians or ministerial contexts, wherever we're in, can we work on ourselves to be the least anxious person in the room? Not to be non-anxious, that's not a real thing, I don't think, but to be the least anxious person in the room is a goal that we talked about.
It's fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that's a little bit of a recap of what many of us have heard. And we want to open up the floor to talk about some of the questions that might be around us that we can talk about together. Any questions that you have already primed, Dr. Strawn, that you'd like us to start with?
Yes, here's one from earlier that I think, since you and I are here, you can speak to, Kristen. The question is, you identified narcissism as a response to a deep sense of shame, a way to overcome a fear of worthlessness. The church historically, for many people, has been a place of shame. So how do you think a church community can speak to that original wound and help heal that inner shame? Is there a way that you believe humility is addressing that original shame?
It's a good question. I think I'll harken back to something I said earlier, and hopefully this is not just a complete repetition. But I do think about the fact that I think shame is the first emotion, like we talked about earlier, kind of mentioned in Scripture. It's the first thing that kind of enters the world, at least that we know of according to Genesis report, after sin. And it's significant to me. I think about my Old Testament professors that I've had in undergrad and in my seminary degree here at Fuller, that the things that entered the world after the fall are usually not good. And sometimes we take them as like, well, this is how things are supposed to be. And so just as a reminder that like shame, this is not how things are supposed to be. So I think being able to remember that having a right view of myself is to say that before the fall, theologically, before things were this way, what was the value and worth that I was given? What does it mean to believe fully and completely that I was made in the image of God? And what does it mean to belong to a church community that sees me as I was intended to be? Sees me as I am, perhaps, and not just as I've been marred by the fall in these ways. And then calls me into that life, calls me towards the fullness of what I was called to, as opposed to like denigrating me or pushing me down in particular ways. As a side note, I think it's super interesting to think about where these theologies of shame might get reinforced. I remember taking a class here at Fuller probably 10 or 12 years ago and learning about Martin Luther. You guys might know Martin Luther, kind of one of the fathers of Protestantism. And I remember learning in class that he was a very anxious man, a very shame-oriented man. He struggled with a lot of guilt. If you know anything about his story, he was trying to make sense of his own imperfections. What does it mean to have 500 plus years of theology that's flown out of someone who's been struggling with his own shame and his own guilt and his own anxiety, such that we have theologies that talk about being less than, being little, being small, and not that that's inaccurate, but it's not the fullness of the gospel. And so what does it mean to know kind of even the psychological histories of those who've given us theology in the first place? And to say maybe churches that are well can help us to say wellness, the fullness of who we're meant to be, means calling us back to where we were at the beginning of the garden, before the fall. We don't fully have a full picture of that. Clearly only got 2 chapters, and most of that is, the animals being named and, having the first 6 days. But it's significant to think about and to imagine who we're called to be, I think. I think that humility helps us to see who we really are, which is the fullness of the goodness of things as well. So that's my first go.
Yes, I also just throw out some other terms. Original blessing. Some people have written about that. Matthew Fox, the idea of a nascent seed of grace that remains inside of each one of us. So many of these are really theologically traditioned and dependent. So, for example, Wesleyans don't always think the same as Reformed folks, right? And so one of the things I love about Fuller, actually, is that we are this place of multiple denominations and multiple theologies. And if we can, we don't always do it perfectly around here, but when we can hold the tension of listening to each other. When I came as a student back in the 90s, I often say my image of God got much bigger because of my colleagues and my teachers and the people I was listening to. They offered alternative, some good and some not so good theologies, but God got bigger in a good way, so that was helpful.
That's right.
That was helpful.
It's a good first question. Other questions that are coming in, or folks want to get in line to ask questions, you're welcome to do that too. We've got a question here.
Yes. Relating to the first...
Could you give us your name as well?
Michael, yes.
Hi, Michael. Go ahead.
MDiv 2018 student.
Nice.
So my question is, a lot of us who are in ministry or just starting out our ministry careers have experienced trauma, narcissism, and all that stuff. So my question is, how do we break cycles of trauma and narcissism when narcissists themselves are often the ones with the most power, like senior pastors, board members, big donors, and how do we foster spaces of mutual accountability with such lopsided power dynamics? And is that even possible?
Yeah. Huge question. You have any initial thoughts?
No, because I'm sorry, I'm multitasking here,
Okay,
sorry.
not a problem. I'll give my first go. It's a really good question, is it, Michael? Thank you. Yes, that's a really huge question. There's so much going on with all of that. Can you repeat the last part of the question, and I'll kind of follow up?
How, in these situations where, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes narcissists have a disproportionate amount of power.
Yeah.
How do we foster spaces of mutual accountability when the power dynamics are so lopsided?
It's a good question. So the first thing that comes to my mind is a distinction that some people make between power and influence. Some people have written some good stuff on this, and I'm not the expert on this, but I appreciate the language and the nuance there. It is true that I think about as a professor in the classroom, I technically hold a great deal of power between me and my students. And I have to acknowledge that and own that. Even when my students are older than me, even when they come in and they've already been practitioners for a long time and they're coming back to school, I still, because of my position, have power. I have to own that, even if I don't feel super powerful in a particular moment. But it doesn't mean that my students don't have influence in the classroom. I am very aware when they're on their phones or on their computers or talking to each other and whispering or doing other things, and they are influencing the classroom space. They're influencing my sense of myself as a professor. They're influencing a lot of things in the classroom. And it's important to say that even if you don't hold the majority of the power in the room, doesn't mean you're not impacting the space and that you can't actually intentionally use that influence. And so I think about this when I'm in positions where I don't hold the most power, which is often in many, many spaces, right? Whether I'm a newer faculty member than those who have been here for a while, right? Or whether I'm in any other space. What does it mean to say, just because I don't hold the most power, doesn't mean I'm not shaping the space in some way? So I get to say then, this is part of where my hopefulness comes from that I alluded to earlier. I can be more hopeful because I think my voice can mean something, even if I'm not the primary person in power. The question that I ask if I'm a student in class, the feedback that I give, the nonverbals. I think about earlier having someone here being an amen corner, right? That was an active engagement of influence in our space that shaped the dynamic of everyone here. And even if she didn't hold the most power, you use the influence that you have in a way that, at least for me, was very meaningful. So I think about back to church systems, to your question, Michael. Even if we don't actually have the position of senior pastor or co-pastor, whatever it is, what does it mean to be saying, I can use whatever I have, and it's best used, I think, in partnership with other people? Who else holds this value of humility in my church congregation? What would it mean if we actually were a diverse set of people who were partnered? So if I'm a younger person, is there any senior person, more senior to me? If I'm a middle-aged person, is there anyone younger than me who also would give this feedback? What if together we offered this feedback to the staff, or we began to shift the dynamic of these times in the foyer? What if we decided? This is actually what it means to have this social action. If you ever look at social action research, to be able to say collectively as a grassroots people, we can do something to influence the space. And I think that really makes a huge difference personally. That gives me a sense of empowerment and encouragement in the moments where I'm like, I don't have any title. I don't know what we're gonna do in this particular moment. So that's my first go at the question.
Yeah, it makes me think too of this idea that some of us might not like, which is maybe decentering the power of the pastor. We set up a lot of our churches where the pastor is the main, it's the CEO, the CFO, all the O's and all the C's. And they may have a board, but the board may be a rubber stamp.
That's right.
And so what if we were to set up communities, this is to your point, right, where actually it's much more egalitarian and democratic. Now, there's cultural issues in there that we have to acknowledge too and talk about and think about. But it seems like a lot of the narcissistic moments that go off the rails often have to do with a minister who has ultimate power and no accountability, or little to no accountability. And so however we can play with that dynamic, decentering the pastor, what is the pastor supposed to do? I mean, I'm asking that question all the time. People come to me with things sometimes. I'm only a part-time pastor, and they come to me and I'm like, why are you asking me this? I don't say that, I think it, right? But I'm like surprised, I love when the disciples come to Jesus and they say, these people need something to eat, and Jesus says, well, give them something.
That's right.
Of course, then he does a miracle, but I still love that you do it, right? And so I think there's something to be said about that too. Yeah.
That's right. I think what I hear and what you're saying is this kind of remembering that regardless of what our position is, we have some influence. We have some say, that we've been called to partner with God in whatever is supposed to happen.
Let me jump in here, Kristen, with the online question. Are pastors more narcissistic than the general population? I keep hearing about this, but I've not heard of any studies that clearly establish this. Actually, we did mention a couple studies this morning that have done epidemiological research and have suggested that pastors are, in fact, at least in those samples, we always have to be careful with our research, but in those samples, they showed pastors higher levels of narcissism than the general population, and even clinical samples. That is the people who are coming to therapy. But the question goes on, might it be more likely that narcissism tends to find its way into churches that are high profile, lower on accountability, and conducive to a rock star leadership model? So it seems like there's a couple things going on maybe there. And Kristen, you give your perspective obviously as well too, but I do think that there might be something about a narcissistic organization that is attracted to the helping professions, and also professions where one can perform and get accolades and be seen and defend against shame. So it doesn't have to be pastor, but I think there's something about that. And then as we mentioned, there's also something sociocultural where congregations, communities may also feed into that. I think some people want their pastors to be narcissists. I'm stating that really egregiously, I know. But it's like we want our pastor to be the biggest story on the block, you know? And so how do you not live into that, or how do you manage that? I think that would be really, really challenging and difficult. There's a little bit of research, remind me if I'm getting this right, Kristen, that you see more overt narcissists in bigger churches and more covert narcissists in smaller churches, which is interesting. I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, but.
Yeah, it is super interesting. And I don't know much about kind of why that might be or how it maps out or pans out, but it is super interesting to me. I also just think about kind of shifting church culture in general, just this idea to shift church culture back to what I was saying before. I just think that has to be done kind of together, saying we want to set a new way of doing things, and we have to figure out how can we. I often think about, I'm not a behaviorist, but I often think about behavioral reinforcement. If there's a pastor that is kind of continually acting in a way that seems to be completely narcissistic, every once in a while when she, for instance, does not act in a narcissistic way, what does it mean for me to reinforce and to affirm that? To say, I really appreciate the guest speaker that you invited today. I appreciated how what they said complemented what you said last week. I love having a chance to be able to hear these two things together. There are many ways to reframe things that we actually want to shift in society. Those little things are moments of influence to be able to offer feedback in a way that hopefully can be heard, but also can be meaningful and perhaps lead to substantive, continual behavioral change.
Here's another one. There's a common notion that people who may have narcissism or those traits do not seek therapy. Do you find that to be true? I think there's some truth to that. Also, there is some truth to the empirical literature that oftentimes narcissists don't do really well in therapy. However, I think Kristen and I would argue about this, not with each other, we'd agree probably, but that from certain theoretical orientations, if you're able to do long-term intensive work with someone who has narcissistic traits, and you particularly are probably treating them, I would even argue from like a self-psychological perspective, that'll mean something to some people in the room. I think there's some hope. I find that narcissists come to therapy when they hit rock bottom, right? And oftentimes, you often can see a comorbid addiction issues are not unusual, and so maybe a narcissist gets caught by somebody because they've been doing some kind of addiction, and that's what runs them to therapy. Or a marriage ends, or a kid says, I hate you, and they come in. And what I'm really hoping for is a narcissist in pain. If they're feeling pain, then I think there's hope. Otherwise, it's just everyone else is bad. So, and developing curiosity, right? You're really trying to help them think about, could it possibly be that there's something going on inside of you that is at times evoking something inside of someone else?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think about having a narcissist or really anyone coming to us when they are in pain. And the phrase that comes to my mind is handle with care. Kind of when we see like fragile on a box, like it ought to signal to us, do something different than what you might normally do. And I think about how counterintuitive that is because narcissists present in such a way that rubs us the wrong way. Like, you're full of yourself and I'm not interested in talking to you, even if I'm your therapist, Like, it stirs up something for us. And so what does it mean to be able to remind ourselves, to the point that Dr. Strawn was making earlier about shame being the underside of narcissism? And if I can remember that, then I can stick it out with you if you're my client, or with you if you're my parishioner in my church, or with you if you're my friend or my mom or whoever you are, to kind of do life with you, especially if we're doing clinical work, to do the clinical practice work with you long enough to actually get to that pain if you're not presenting with the pain when you first come, if you've come for some other reason like you talked about.
Here's a great one that some people might have in the room too. What is the professional limit for clergy who lacks professional education in psychology when working with a narcissist in the church?
I'm going to defer to you, and then I will take that.
One of the things I've enjoyed teaching here at Fuller on the School of Mission and Theology side is pastoral counseling. And one of the first things I tell my students is, I'm not training you to be counselors. I'm training you. I want to train you to know your limits. I want to train you to have a little bit of a capacity to triage very common mental health issues and help you know how and when to refer. Not only for the good of your parishioners, but for your own good. There's lots of stories where a pastor has extended his or her capacities and it's hurt them as much as it's hurt the person, and even hurt the church, because factions can happen and, angry. And he said, you can't believe what the pastor said. And of course, no one knows what really happened in the privacy of your room. So I even beyond narcissism, I would say that clergy should consider carefully in what capacities they want to meet with parishioners, what they want to meet with them for, and how frequently, how often. And so I usually tell my students, no more than 3 sessions. If you can't help a person, if you can't resource them, if you can't get them moving in the right direction in 3 sessions, then maybe there's something else going on here that you need to refer them out. That doesn't mean abandoning them. That doesn't mean you don't stop being their pastor. You don't stop praying with them, maybe even. But whatever that topic is they brought in, they want you to help them with, it's probably time to move that onto someone else.
Yeah. I think I'd add to that by saying to pay attention to when we're asking ourselves the question, like, I really don't know what to do here. Like, when that becomes a theme over and over again, then as opposed to pushing past it, but I have to know what to do because I'm a pastor. I have to know what to do because I'm this person. I'm the therapist even. This is the time to consult. This is the time to refer in the case of a pastor, to say, I keep saying I don't know, so let me find someone who might know more than I do. And I think that feels counterintuitive for those of us who are in ministry, because the point is you just kind of stick it out with people indefinitely, forgetting that we're actually finite. Like, we are limited human beings. I wrestle with God about this every day. Like, is there a reason I'm finite? Couldn't I have more energy
right.
and more time?
Please.
And for whatever reason, before the fall, we were created finite. And so being able to pay attention to when I'm like, I don't know what to do, and I keep not knowing what to do, maybe that means that this is time for a collaboration. It's time to do that referral process.
That's great.
We have some microphones out here, so if people want to stand up, a couple of folks are able
You
to.
could go to a mic.
I will speak up.
Okay, well,
we
let's
have
take this one here.
behind you first. One person's
There's
behind
someone
you.
on the microphone.
Yep.
The problem is there are people online.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No worries. Go ahead.
I was sitting here wanting to push back a little bit about shame and the bad rap it's getting. I couldn't help but think of a scene in the movie Gandhi, if you've ever seen it. He is telling his wife she needs to clean the latrines. And she's not from the lowest caste. And she's objecting and saying, I will never, ever, ever. And he harshly says, in effect, you're not my wife anymore, get out, go away. And she says, have you no shame? Mm. And I think there's something valuable there. I'm sitting here trying to sort it through.
Yes,
the best I can get so far, but I'd be interested in your responses, is shame is not a place to settle in, to dwell in, to make it your identity. But there is still a place for shame, and no shame is a problem.
Yeah. Could you give us your name again?
Oh, my name's Paul.
Paul,
Kelly.
thank you.
And I don't know if you wrote this in, Paul, but there is a question about shame. Did you write it in? I wrote it in. You wrote it in, okay. Nice. Some research shows that there is a healthy shame similar to healthy narcissism. What are your thoughts on healthy shame?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Good.
My first thought was going to be exactly what Dr. Agonifer raised in her question regarding the research, is that we are talking about shame as if, like, kind of the way that most people talk about narcissism, as if there's only unhealthy narcissism. So I appreciate the feedback, the pushback, the corrective. It's appropriate to say there are other forms of shame. Earlier, we mentioned honor-shame cultures, for instance, and I don't want it to be like, oh, shame is the bad side of an honor-shame culture. That's inaccurate. That's not correct. So I'm very glad for us to be more explicit about that. I do think, typically when I say shame, I'm talking about the shame that means I am bad. And that's often how I hear it in kind of my American context. That's not how everyone means it, so I'm glad to be a little bit more nuanced there. And to be able to say shame, in my estimation, based on kind of the classes I've had, have to do with shame, which is I am bad, compared to guilt, which is what I have done is bad. My behavior is bad, and my behavior needs to be corrected. And I am the agent who kind of did that behavior, so I must take responsibility for it. But that doesn't mean my whole person needs to be kind of seen as loathsome or that worm that I was talking about earlier. But I do think there is an appropriate sense of shame, which really I think is connected to pride, an appropriate sense of I have pride in my family or our family's name or our reputation. And so I don't want to shame kind of this community or myself in some way. There's an appropriate sense, I think, of saying we don't want that to kind of be the reputation that we have based on what we do. There's way more nuance there that there are other experts on shame in that way, but that's my initial thought.
Yeah, there's another question that's kind of dealing with that as well and sort of citing biblical examples. Isaiah stands and says, woe is me, for I am undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. Job says, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And of course, Paul in Philippians says, in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. So I think there's a difference between humility and shame. Again, humility in some ways, just like intellectual humility is that idea, again, of recognizing both our limitations as well as our strengths. But we can do that in relationship to other people as well, not placing ourselves over them, right? So I think there's a strong statement in Scripture about consider others better than yourselves. That shows up in a number of different ways in a number of different places in Scripture. But I don't think that's the same as feel bad about yourself. I think it's a little bit of a different, but sometimes we do need to feel bad about ourselves or something that we've done, right? And that's what repentance is about, right?
And just to throw in a little integrative moment, I think about the fact that with our translations of Scripture, because they come at different time periods, right? A translation done in 2011 versus 1988 versus 1600 means that we're using language, the same words, but the words can mean different things. This is part of why going to seminary can be really helpful, of having that Greek and Hebrew understanding of what is this concept of shame in a Hebrew sense as perhaps different from a Greek sense, as perhaps different from a North American sense in the 21st century by a white person compared to a Black person. Like that, those nuances matter. That's kind of what we're talking about with cultural differences, both in terms of history and now. Go ahead.
So this was my dissertation area, sorry. The prototypical gesture of shame is to hide one's face. And if you just hide your face and you unhide again, you have a chance for repair. But if it's humiliation and if it comes from the other to annihilate you, then it's irreparable. And that's how I think about the difference between healthy shame and unhealthy shame. You can hide, but if it's healthy shame, you get to come out again.
It's a really intriguing point, thinking about what's done to you kind of versus what you have an agency over for yourself.
Yeah.
Thanks for your point. What's your name again?
Sophie.
Sophie, thank you.
Thank you.
There's a lot of questions here that I think are almost a collective grief, I would describe them as. Sort of asking, what can we do in structures where we want to hold people accountable who refuse to be held accountable? What can we do, in places where certain behaviors are actually being rewarded at the same time that they're damaging other people? I don't know great answers to that, Kristen. Maybe you do, but I do want to acknowledge that sort of collective grief around it, I think, and a sort of sadness. And I want to keep going back. In some ways, I would encourage many of you to think about prevention opposed to just trying to fix what's already broken. Yes, we want to try to meet people at the places where they are, but especially when you think systemically or organizationally, I think what I would say is, what can you put into place now in your sphere of influence that might create healthier contexts? and healthier individuals, and not let any one particular person or group of small group of people rise to kind of some sort of ultimate power and control. I think we grapple with that as a society. We grapple with it politically in the United States. We grapple with it in our church denominations. I was thinking earlier that I was in a church that exploded because the pastor tried to change the worship times. And he wanted to change the worship times because the research was showing that the unchurched were more likely to come at this particular time. And so he wanted to do the more kind of seeker-sensitive service at that time. Well, you can imagine what happened, right? It blew up. And it was a non-denominational church, technically. And I was struck again how there was no system to really help us to work through that. So I've appreciated denominational systems more because of that. However, I also recognize that some of us have been in denominational systems that have been equally damaging. So they don't always live up to the possibility they might have. But again, there's something to be said for some structure, for some agreed upon mechanisms for managing these kinds of problems. And so I've appreciated denominational organization and structure, but I have not idealized it, and also recognize that oftentimes it needs to be changed.
Yeah. I would add to that, just thinking about collective grief. It's important to be able to then grieve some of those things together and not just grieve them individually, like we're all feeling sad individually, but together say this really is a shame. So you borrow that word and kind of use it in a different kind of way. This really is very unfortunate that this is the situation that we're in. And I think we could stick with grief, or collective grief could, as I said a moment ago, lead to collective action. To say, what would it be like for us to collectively ask for a meeting with the pastor or the pastoral team? What would it be like to collectively ask to have kind of this conversation, not just individually talk about it and gossip, that's actually its own other sin issue that we have, but to actually say together, can we give feedback? Could we together write a letter? Could that posture be one that's not just us attacking the person who's attacking us, but to be really clear? And if after collective action proves to be ineffective, as sometimes it does, then sometimes we collectively leave. We together say, not just individually we dropped like flies, but together we said, actually, we're going to go. And I think if that ever happens, that's a painful place to be as well. Then doing that well becomes very important. It's very easy to leave in a huff, to leave like, you pissed me off, I'm super, like whatever, kind of leave with that attitude. And that, I think, defeats the purpose of giving the feedback that we actually wanted the system to be better. So then the story can be when you leave, and I've seen this happen, they're just angry. Like, you missed the point of the anger. The anger was supposed to tell you something, and if all you saw was the anger, then I want to be clear. I want to hope that I was really clear in why I was angry or why we were angry. That didn't get lost in translation. Clearly, sometimes people will see whatever they want to see. But hopefully we've been as clear as possible about the reason behind that. But question here in person or comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to kind of...
No, go ahead.
You're
You're first. Go ahead.
Okay. That's right. Okay. I just want to maybe piggyback a little bit on that piece you just shared and trying to formulate the question in a way that makes sense. So I'm in a space where I have seen some of those narcissistic tendencies. And I guess my question is, how do we sort through when to persevere, when we've given the feedback in love, we've handled with care, and when do we step back when maybe it's self-preservation or the boundaries there for the sake of our own peace with God or our community, and speaking to that collective piece of the leaving. So I'm just curious thoughts on how to do that well and how to discern between the two.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't think you should ever remain in a setting where you're being abused, even if it's church, maybe especially if it's church. I think sometimes people stay longer than they should because they're trying to do the right thing. And that's wonderful and admirable. But if people are being abused, I think we have to take action. I don't mean that loosely or lightly, but thoughtfully. I think sense a lot of pain in what you're describing there. So I think that's kind of the first thing I'd want to say. And people do have to leave sometimes, as you were just saying. I think how we leave, though, is also pretty important. And we can leave representing Christ, embodying Christ, or we can leave, creating dissension and and all of that. And I mean, I think you can leave imaging Christ and still naming, right? You can still name the evil. That's okay. But I think we've all seen people leave in good and problematic ways. And so again, I think it's such an individual, journey in that because of a particular social location and what's going on there. But if you need to leave, you need to leave. And that's whether it's a marriage, right? Or a family or a friendship or a church. There are times when sometimes you have to leave. Jesus said, shake the dust off. That may not be good biblical exegesis, but I'm going with it for right now.
I think I will echo that there are times that we do have to leave, and I think that requires great discernment, which is what I think I hear you asking about, is how do we discern? And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all, like Dr. Strawn is saying. I do think really careful prayer becomes very important. And I think prayer in community with other people, asking, like, are you hearing what I'm hearing? Particularly when there are situations, at least for me, where I'm not hearing anything. Like, is God even listening? Like, hello, what's happening? It's been really quiet for a long time. It's been fuzzy for a long time. I hear static. Hearing are other people also praying and discerning, not just what they want for me, but really they actually have this connection with the Spirit that isn't just about what they want for me. Those few people, those handful of people become really important for me in my discernment process. There's also a book I want to recommend by another psychologist who does integration that many of you may know about, Dr. Henry Cloud. I think about his work. He has a million books that are so good. One of them, though, is called Necessary Endings. Yes. And he talks about the significance of hopelessness as a virtue. And he says that hopelessness, when it's appropriate, is when you look at a situation or a person and you realize in this relationship, for instance, over and over and over again, the pattern has remained the same, even with intervention. So it's different if we haven't done anything, it's just always this way. But if I've said something, if other people have said something and nothing has shifted, he talks about the fact that hope needs to be grounded in evidence. There's a reason to have hope. Scripture even talks about that. There's a reason for the hope that's within us. It's not just blind hope. And so what does it mean if there's no evidence for shifting? Then me staying here, like, Spirit, are you telling me there's something here that I just haven't gotten to yet? Or actually there is no hope. There's no evidence from the past or the present. And your Spirit hasn't given me any indication of evidence for shift for the future. At least that has to do with me being here. And it doesn't mean that after we leave, for instance, a congregation or a community, doesn't mean that the change won't happen later. And that gets to be tricky. Like, maybe if I had stayed just another 6 months or another 2 years or another whatever it was. But we pay attention to, is the Spirit asking me to be here in this space now? Because we don't know what the impact is of our presence or our absence. And so that, I think, requires, at least in my experience, for places where I've felt a need to leave, which has been deeply painful, to have other people a part of that discernment process with me. So I'm leaving in the Spirit and with the posture that I hope is one that's healthy and good.
And sometimes maybe not making a decision is a way to defend ourselves against the grief that we will feel when we make the decision. And that's painful too. Yes.
So my name is Vernon. My question is from the second seminar I sat in where we were really talking about, from my perspective, doing ministry cross-culturally. And the question is there any evidence that I might read or consider where anyone tried to use Google Translate to allow people to speak their home language, and in me as being totally and only fluent, regrettably, in English, to understand it? The reason I ask this question is, as a special ed teacher for LA Unified during the lockdown, all I had was Google Translate, and 12 of my 15 students for whom English was not the home language. And the only way that I survived that was Google Translate. What I found was that the conversations I was able to have were far more robust than when I was ringing up central office for a translator or running next door to my neighbor teachers who happened to be fluent in Spanish, didn't have those resources. All I had was Google Translate. So I'm wondering if, and this is an open question, anybody in the room, because it just struck me sitting there that Google Translate basically saved my teaching
That's great.
in a moment when it was
They should get you
totally
on a commercial.
necessary. Yeah, really. You know,
Save
and
my teaching.
And no one is paying me a dime for this. But it's true. It really happened, and
Yeah.
that's why I wanted to ask the question.
That's great. I don't know of any specific research, but I would not doubt that there probably is something. Because every time I look up something, I find something on whatever it is. So it might be worth a quick look through the literature to see what is out there. But yeah, there's communications, yeah, probably educational teaching, cross-cultural educational teaching. You make me think of one thing that's kind of interesting. I'll just mention, it's not the same thing, but there is a church that meets within my church called La Fuente, and their church is completely bilingual, meaning everything they do is in Spanish and in English, which is really interesting, right? And I don't know, that'd be fun to study, right? How is that different? What are they trying to accomplish? What's the goal of that? And how does that impact people? And part of the reason they do that is some people only speak Spanish and some people only speak English. But doing it all together also creates something different and unique and emergent, I think, from that. Yeah. Take another one in the room and then we'll go to another one online here.
I'm Max. I'm in the DMFT program. Anecdotally, I think that something that I've been thinking about all day based on this topic is that y'all spent a decent amount of time in the initial conversation providing definition for the terms you were using. And in my office, I see, I think, a lack of clarity around the concept of pride in the Christian community, in the perception that it seems that any attempt of a humble recognition of the good that we have, not just the Imago Dei, but in addition to like skill, talent, ability, appearance. I'm curious how you interact with that when you're attempting to foster humility as a skill that's developing, in helping people retain an understanding of how to navigate not just accepting the negative or the difficult, but also accepting a holistic view of oneself.
Yeah. I love that question. I think many of the people that come to our offices, remember, again, it's not really narcissists who usually come, but many of the people who come to us are deeply shamed. But their defense mechanism is not grandiosity. It's not narcissism necessarily. And so if I hear what you're saying, I agree. A lot of the work is around helping reconstruct a healthy sense of self, which would include, in my mind, feeling good about oneself, feeling prideful. It's that healthy narcissism that we talked about before, recognizing my limitations, but also celebrating my accomplishments. I'd always, I get to do a lot of long-term therapy, which I love. And almost always I reach a point with someone where they'll say something like, is it okay to celebrate good stuff in here? And I'm like, yes, let's do that. I had another case of someone who came in and they were just doing fabulous, really hard, difficult work. And their life began to change really dramatically. And they were getting better and better and better. And, then you start thinking about or wondering, how should we keep meeting? How often should we meet? All that. And this client said, would it be okay if I came and sat on your couch even if I was doing well? Because then that's another experience, right? Some of our clients have never had that experience of someone coming alongside of them when they're doing well. And they actually think they have to be in crisis to get cared for. So, yeah, I think that's lovely what you're bringing up.
I agree with that. And I just would add, I think one of my favorite aspects of being a therapist is getting to those moments, right? Months and years into the work to celebrate. And I really think whether you're the therapist or a pastor or a mentor, one of your goals, I hope, is to look for moments to celebrate and to bring them up. One of my favorite things is to say, do you remember 6 months ago what we were talking about? Do you remember 2 years ago what you told me? Do you remember 6 years ago where you said you'd never tell your husband this? And now you've revealed the thing that was super shameful for you, the thing you thought he could never hold. The work you've done in marital therapy for him to be able to hold it, the work we've done here for you to be able to share it. Like those moments I think are beautiful and worth celebrating. And I think to your question, Max, I think they are moments of appropriate pride. And I do think that pride, again, just like shame, right? We have to be really careful with what definitions we're using in the first place, right? But I do think there is a healthy sense of pride, a healthy sense of celebration. And I'll close just by remembering the prophet kind of in the book of Zephaniah talking about the celebration that God does over his own people. God's celebration, God rejoicing over God's own people with singing or dancing, some translations say, this deep sense of celebration. That's also, when I say the image of God, I mean that really robustly. Part of what it means for us to image God is in the fullness of what it means for us to be human, which means understanding the fullness of what it means for God to be God. And understanding that requires some nuance and some discipleship and all those things. But I think that celebration and a healthy sense of pride comes with that too. Yes. I think we have.
I would just take one online here real quick, and then we'll get to you. There's so many good ones coming in here. This one I think would be worth just interacting with. What are preventative measures churches could use to screen for narcissism in a hiring process? Or what are things to flag in an interview process?
That's a good question. I mean, I think part of what we look for in the interview is part of what we talked about earlier with those diagnostic criteria. There's those 6 things that are not in the diagnoses, but just 6 things we often see in clergy. Part of what I love whenever I'm interviewing people is to ask them to tell me a story of when things have gone poorly and what they did. And I have heard people in interviews tell me a story of what they did, but the posture in which they talk about what they did, even if they think they did something, like ideally, like when I ask them, when did something go poorly? And then what was your response? And even in that, sometimes I hear this defensiveness and this pridefulness that though they technically did the right thing, their posture and attitude does not cue to me that they're actually in a healthy or responsible place. And so part of what I listen for is, how do you tell your story about things that have gone poorly, that have gone wrong? What does humility even look like in the recollection of those things? What does humility look like in the hypothetical? If this was a situation, we do this in clinical practice a lot with case conceptualization and vignettes. If you had this one-page situation in front of you, how would you respond? What would your posture be? And to me, I'm not listening just for your words. Words don't mean very much to me because of my own background. You can say a lot of things. But I need to see if your posture and if your actions line up with the words that you're saying. And so hopefully the interview process is robust enough, right, that's actually, I can see that, which means I can't do a 30-minute interview. I can't do an hour interview. I can't just look at your CV or your resume and assume that your behaviors tell me everything. I need to have a committee that's actually paying attention to cultural layers. And that's more work in the interview process. We talked about that earlier. But I think the work can be worth it to not have to hire someone again in 2 years. That retention might be for someone who's healthy. So that's my first thought.
I love that. And I think this is maybe not different than what you're saying, but I like to add the question too, and what did you learn from it? Because you get a lot of self-awareness or lack of self-awareness in that. And it's interesting to me how many times people just ignore the last part of that. They don't tell you what they learned because they didn't really learn anything. Or you could say, what did you learn about yourself from that? When you ask about instruments, if you're referring to that, I mean, we're clinical psychologists, so we're very picky about instruments. And there's some instruments that are actually can measure narcissism, but you can only actually give them if you're a clinical psychologist because you have to be trained on how to use them. So I don't know of any fast screeners, but I think that this is what we're describing. And don't forget what social psychology says. The best predictor of future job performance is actually past job performance. So call those references. Talk to people. Look it up. Find out what you can.
That's right. And I think the final thing I'll say there is it's important to keep in mind if someone does have some past experiences where they did make wrong calls, right? They are the pastor who's coming out of doing things poorly and trying to figure out, can I re-enter ministry? That type of thing. Though it is true that our past behavior does predict typically where we will go, we do believe that repentance is genuinely possible, that a shift in course, so the 180 change can happen, but that's not just based on self-report. That is where those references and other people actually become very important. Who else will corroborate your story? Who else helps us see that there's been a characterological shift? I think that's possible to try and make space for. Again, I think it's more work, but I think it can be worth it. So I'll throw that out there. We have a question or comment here.
At the microphone here,
Yes.
yeah.
It's a little high.
Is it Julie?
Okay.
Is it Julie? Is that right?
Yes.
Hello, Julie. Yes, please.
Thank you, Drs. Strawn and Fort. I have this question. Could you maybe give a little bit more of a bird's eye view or a larger landscape about this issue of NPD and narcissistic tendencies among pastors and ministers? I'm personally interested, not just qualitatively, like what does it look like, how is it impacting congregations, but quantitatively, how big of an issue is this? I know the two of you have mentioned studies and some facts and figures. If you can, on the top of your heads, tell us a little bit more, just to give us a better sense of perspective. Yeah.
Like how pervasive is this?
Yeah,
in
yeah.
churches?
I guess that's one part of the question that I'm asking.
The other part would be, we're thinking about kind of the big picture.
I think so, because partly what I am sorting through in my mind as well, I've absolutely seen what I would consider narcissistic pastors, but I've also grown up in very small, humble churches where pastors are literally, well, maybe this is part of the covert narcissism that you're talking about, but live a life of self-sacrifice. And from day one till their dying day, I've seen folks do a lot for a little, even in terms of acknowledgement. And so I'm just wondering, like, how much of an issue is this? Because I absolutely do believe that it is an issue, but could you situate us a little more and say a little bit more about the larger, like, lay of the land, I guess? I hope that's communicating itself, yeah.
I think my initial thought is I find it really difficult to answer your question well. And it's not just because there's way more articles to keep reading and there's different cultural contexts and nuances to pay attention to, but I think because there's so much nuance and because definitions, to the point that Max was making earlier, like I think are really important. That's why we spend so much time talking about them. I also think because we don't all use the same definitions, that even researchers don't always have the exact same everything. Like I want to be careful to then generalize and say, kind of, this is what I see. I think that there is literature, like we've talked about, and Dr. Strawn can say more about this, there is literature that says that when we're looking at clinicals or we're looking at pastoral samples compared to other people who've been sampled, their numbers are higher. So they're going to be, like, if we had a room of 100 people, 100 pastors and 100 lay people, there are more pastors, right? And so I don't know what that number is, and I'm making this up. But let's say that there's 30 pastors who have these narcissistic tendencies, and there might be 22 normal people who have these narcissistic tendencies. The number is higher, kind of, for the clergy that we see compared to some others based on the literature that we're referencing, right? But it's also true that every study is not paying attention to ethnic group differences. And for me, especially when we're talking about covert narcissism, that's really important to pay attention to. If that sample of 100 people didn't have an accurate representation of Asian American, African American, Latinx go across the board, then I can't generalize in the way I'd like to. And I think especially because you're talking about sacrifice, and I've seen this a lot in the churches, at every church I've been to, at least the vast majority of them, deep sacrifice has been a big part of what they've done. And I think that while some aspects of what I've seen in them might look like covert narcissism, I think some parts of it are not. And that's part of what makes the definition so important, and the cultural ways of appraising things, I think, so important as well. So I wish there was an answer that was more generalizable that I could give. And at this point, I think I can't, but I appreciate the question.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said. Maybe one of the ways that might help us is to think or ask another question. How is narcissism a central aspect of our culture at this time? And so rather than say, is it here or not, we might ask, how is it here? And how is it being destructive? And that may not be with the pastor, right? It might be in other settings, but I don't think we have the data yet to be able to say, you know, it's really pervasive. 50% of churches have a narcissist on staff. We can't say that at this point.
Thank you for the question.
Good, fair question,
It's a
though.
good one. Yeah.
Where do we
I think
go?
we're over, I don't actually remember. Maybe.
Okay, well, I see a humble gesturing over here, so we'll let you go, and then
think we
we'll go
have-
here, and then we'll take another one online.
Hi, my name is Ingrid, and we did have to leave our church about 3 years ago due to a pastor with narcissism, and it was heartbreaking. My heart goes out to the person who shared earlier, because that was our home church for 24 years. So my question to you is, do you have a good resource for healing after that experience? Just to tag on to that, just to trust again and go into another church experience has been a very interesting journey. So if you have any suggestions or resources.
There may be some in the room. I have to admit that I spend so much time reading technical material that sometimes I don't have great resources that are really accessible. So nothing's immediately coming to mind. I think there are some, but there's some healing. I see a hand up there. Do you know something?
Yeah, I think when narcissism comes to church,
Ah, yes.
subtitle has a lot to do with healing.
when narcissism comes to church, and also Let Us Pray. It has a section on healing the individual and healing the church. Thank you. Yeah.
And that, remember that pray is P-R-E-Y.
EY,
The
yeah.
other Let Us
Let
Pray,
us
the play on words.
Pray.
Right. You have a resource as well? Yeah.
Yeah, if you just type in recovery from narcissism workbooks, there's a couple.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
You can say that online for the,
Yeah, Recovery from Narcissism workbooks. If you type that into Google or some other search engine, it sounds like some good, helpful workbooks will also become available. Thank you. Glad to be learning from you all as you ask good questions. Thank you for sharing the resources.
Yeah, please.
Hi, Angie, DMFT program. Earlier you spoke about what could bring people who struggle with narcissistic personality disorder or narcissistic traits into treatment. And you mentioned pain as a big source of that. And I don't want to negate that, but I'm also cognizant that a lot of people, especially those who meet the criteria for NPD, may be seeking therapy because they have to or they're forced to, right? Because of the comorbidity with other things like domestic violence or, addiction that creates harm for others in a physically violent way. And so I'm curious, how do you differentiate between enabling narcissistic tendencies in the spirit of building rapport and actually being a conduit and a catalyst for healing for that patient without condoning, right? Because I recognize that may be a thin line, and it's something that I've struggled with personally in my personal practice, because I certainly don't want to be perpetuating a cycle of violence. And I'm also cognizant that somebody struggling with NPD might know how to present and might be weaponizing the therapeutic process in and of itself. And then you are being triangulated and pulled into, you're one more cog in the machine that is enabling this cluster B type personality disorder. So that's kind of what I've been struggling with all day, and it's taken me a while to formulate the question.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Thank you for it,
That's
Angie.
great. Let me just clarify. I don't think narcissists necessarily come in with pain. I'm excited when they express pain, because that means that maybe there's a break in the defensive structure enough that I could get in there. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. You were going to say something? Go for it.
I should find my thought.
Did I make you lose it? I'm sorry.
Just gotta start listening to what you were saying. I think the thing that I was thinking about had to do with the rapport building. I think this goes across the board, but maybe particularly for narcissism. I'm not actually a narcissism expert. So I want to throw that out there. It's a topic that's meaningful to me, and I think it really impacts the church. I can think about its clinical implications, but I am not a narcissistic expert. So I just want to say that again. That being said, that to your point about building rapport and trying not to kind of reinforce these kind of ways of being or kind of these enactments that some folks might talk about and kind of getting sucked into them. To me, when I think about rapport building, it can only be done for me based on the truth. So if I build rapport with you, it's not because I'm finding a way to butter you up or to find something that just makes us both happy in this moment. Genuine rapport building is saying, I genuinely appreciate the humor that you bring into the room. I genuinely appreciate kind of the posture that you had at the beginning of the session. I genuinely appreciate your intellectual curiosity. Whatever it is that we can connect on that I can affirm, whenever I affirm, my hope is that it's based in the truth. So that when I tell the other part of the truth, this part of your violence against your wife is absolutely unacceptable. Like I have zero tolerance, zero. And my clients will also know that. I actually think of a client who I worked with for 5.5 years. And at the end of our session, we're talking through a million things in her life. And I struggled and still struggle with her partner. And it's just a really violent partner that she had, and he happens to be a pastor. And so I can't tell you about how triggering it was for me to be in session with her day in, day out, listening. Her husband also happens to make some beautiful things. And so at the end of our time, we were terminating our work. She was like, I wanted to bring you something. I wanted to bring you something my husband makes. But I knew that you wouldn't be able to take whatever he makes as a gift. I'm like, you're right. I've been able to be honest enough in our work that I cannot see anything that he has brought, and I don't have that space, that tolerance, because you're still in this relationship trying to work some things out. So for me, telling the truth means, of course, like he wasn't my client, but telling the truth means that I can both build this rapport with the person, even if they are the person perpetuating other issues, and also the other part of the truth is this is unacceptable. So when we're talking about things in this way, you're going to hear both the things that I can affirm and the things I can't affirm. And I hope I can do that in a way that you always feel like you're incredibly valuable. Even if I don't affirm this thing, this choice, that you continue to stay with your partner in these ways. That's a struggle for me. But it doesn't mean that you're not discerning something, but we have to figure something out. And so for me, at least, back to the rapport building, that's the part I wanted to emphasize. The truth becomes really important on all sides. And that's how I know we can do our really good work, because you can handle the truth, and I can also learn to handle the truth. And we can say it graciously, openly, and have enough time that we're working together that the truth can come out well. So
I would say, too, just to add real quickly, a clinical stance that I have with narcissists, and this used to be my most difficult patient when I was younger, especially when I had like an older male narcissist. Now I'm old enough and got gray in my beard that this is helpful. But my approach with them is very frank, and I let them have my mind all the time. So I ask very poignant questions, or I say, I don't understand that. But I also let them know how I'm reasoning, because one of the problems with the narcissist is they don't have a theory of mind. And so Peter Fonagy says that what we have to do is we have to demonstrate how we're arriving at thinking. That helps the narcissist begin to recognize, oh, other people think, and this is how they do it. So I had a very narcissistic client a couple years ago. Said he was this whole thing about his wife, right? He said this to his wife, and then she just lost it. I can't even understand why she was upset. And I just said, well, you don't understand why she was upset? Like, it just asked with a lot of heat too, right? He's like, well, maybe. Well, let's talk about it. Why might she have been upset, right? So now I push him to take a perspectival approach. I want him to try to get into the mind of someone else. But there's a lot of treatments out there and a lot of styles to it, but I don't think you have to be Carl Rogers to be a good therapist, right? You can be empathic and also lovingly confrontational, or letting them into your mind, or, so good luck to you. Those are great questions.
it was.
Somebody online here, I knew we were gonna get this question.
Okay, let's hear
It's the digital age question.
Okay, you did know.
In the days of digital age, we talk often about narcissism, which makes it seem like this is a pervasive problem. What keeps coming up is the idea of wounding and pain and how they can look different, whether it shows up as a character problem or other forms of mental health issues. Here's the question. What do you have to say about the digital age and the impact it is having on how we tell our stories of pain? It's not exactly the question I thought. I thought we might get a question of how is the digital age contributing to the development of narcissism?
Do you want to take a stab?
At the one I just asked, or this one?
The one you just asked. Or that one, I mean.
Well, there's a certain way, right? Many people have said this idea that the social media is a way that many of us can put ourselves out into the world in hopes of validation. Now, that's not all that happens on social media. Some wonderful things happen on the social media world. But I think it also has put some pressure on our younger children and young adults, and there's some research around this, right, too, of how my sense of identity or sense of self may or may not be validated literally by how many likes I get when I put something up, or if someone, forwards what I did. So I think there's ways in which social media is just a faster, newer way to put ourselves kind of at risk in hopes of getting validation. But then the flip side of that is that we can easily be hurt and wounded in ways that maybe we wouldn't have had such a broad reach of that wounding. There's not, if you have 800 friends and then you do something and they all come down on you, that wouldn't have happened to me when I was in junior high, because we didn't have, my 7 friends would have given me a hard time, and that would have been it for the most part, unless I fell at a school dance or something strange. But so it does impacting. I think though that, I've written about technology and the way that I think it can actually enhance our lives. So I don't want to be a Luddite. I don't want to blame technology. That's an easy go-to as well. But I want to say, especially as Christians, I think we should exegete our technology. We should ask questions. What is it forming us into? How is it shaping us? And how is it shaping our expectations? How is it shaping our, as James K. Smith says, our telos, our goal, that thing that we ultimately value. So I think technology can be good, it can be bad, but there's certainly some argument to be made that there's something about the exposure of the self, and maybe that goes back to shame too. Maybe we should be more ashamed of some of the things we put on social media.
Steve. I think to that point about exposure, I want to say that I've been talking to a friend of mine recently who's been mentioning kind of this recurring theme in many different spaces of people being overexposed and underdeveloped. This combination of being overexposed and underdeveloped, and I think that social media kind of makes space for that. This friend is often talking about this in the context of discipleship, where someone's kind of not discipled very well. There's a malformation taking place, and they're pushed out into leadership. Go be the youth pastor before you've been a youth leader for a year or 2 or 3. Go be the person because you have a speaking gift. Go preach without having kind of the discipleship that prepares you for the exposure. And I think social media often then highlights exposure as well. And so I think in terms of how we're telling our stories, I think what I notice is that we're telling our stories before we fully formed them. And as an author, whenever I write, whether that's a piece for publication or whether that's something else, I need time to sit with it. I think about my first English teacher or English professor in college saying, the first thing you do is after you've written your, horrible first drafts is to let the draft sit. And that's a struggle for some of us, especially if we are procrastinating or like, here's my hot take, here's whatever it is, like that's what we want in the moment. But letting something sit, I think allows us to be conscientious. Is this the story I want to tell? And I think social media, not itself, to Dr. Strawn's point, but the way we often use it is to say, I'm going to tell it immediately in the moment, in the 30 seconds between, right now and the light changing. I'll go ahead and write this thing real fast and then keep going. And I think that sometimes it's fine, but I think perhaps there's a little bit more intention that can be helpful for us in terms of what story we tell and then kind of how we respond to the exposure that we receive and if we're ready for that exposure. I think we have a comment here in the room that I wanted to make space for. Yeah.
That was actually my question. And the reason why I brought it up, hi everyone, my name is Aiden, is because I have clients who come to therapy and they will say, my father's a narcissist and my mother's a narcissist. It's such a language that's used so often, like you said, Dr. Strawn, about trauma and all these other terms that society gets excited about. So what I'm noticing is even on social media, like you said, in 30 seconds, as the therapist or your average person, they're going on there to define narcissism and what it looks like. So there's a social definition of it that doesn't even fit the DSM criteria. So of course, as therapists, we have to educate. We have to ask, what do you mean by that? What are you seeing? Let's try to discern this together to see whether or not that's the case. But what I find is so nuanced, and it breaks my heart because all of us are coming in and saying, yes, narcissism is growing. Is it, right? Is the prevalence going up, or is it that we're all using our own definitions? And maybe it's not narcissism. Maybe it's borderline personality disorder. Maybe something else. But even as a clinician, I have to stop myself and say, wait a minute, there's more to it. It is so complicated that I have to take the time out to really tease it apart and see what kind of character problem is this? It's not all narcissism. Or what is it? Is it some form of a traumatic reaction that is temporary versus that's the person's trait? Right?
Yes,
it's just a state for a time being, but yet we've used it as a permanent label. And so I just want us to talk a little bit about that. Like, well, how do we deal with that as average human beings or clinicians or pastors when everybody's coming to us and saying this is narcissism? I'm not denying that it doesn't occur.
Yeah.
It is a real problem, but also the way in which we're all saying is happening all the time. I just want you to comment on that.
Yeah. In my mind's going so many places. I'm editing myself right now. I just want to be honest because I'm going to offend someone if I say what I'm thinking. Say it. There's such a tendency, isn't there, to want to label, and sometimes even like a positive label. Oh, this is my Myers-Briggs. This is my Enneagram number. Careful, right? And or a pathological label as well. And then that's all the person is.
That's right.
I think one of the things the most thoughtful clinicians I've interacted with, when they use a label, it's almost like a last resort. It's only to try to help them understand developmentally what might be going on. And they also hold this tendency that that's not all the person is. I mean, I think, where I learned this specifically was working with the chronically mentally ill, those with schizophrenia. Was it so easy? This is a schizophrenic. And I was taught early on, there's a person there. And so But I think also you're naming the really important nuance that good clinicians do, which is that diagnostic issue around what else is going on. What else could be going on around here? And if we go too quickly to labels, we can miss something for sure. So I don't know, I'm just jumping off your good comment. I think that's what you wanted, right?
Yeah. I also want to say thank you, Dr. Agana, for the question. It's a really good one, and even more so for the context that you provided behind it. I do think that we are often quick to jump to labels or to categories. And I think it's because it creates some sense of grounding for us. And I think we're really quick to try and overgeneralize. Back to Julie's question, like, can we talk about what the prevalence is? It's a good question. But I think it's disorienting to say perhaps no. Like perhaps we don't actually have enough information, or perhaps this actually isn't the best label, but people have been using it. I think if we say this isn't the right term, or I actually don't immediately provide what the right term is, people get really disoriented. I think part of what hopefully we as clinicians are helping people do is to sit in the tension. We don't yet have a word or a label that seems to fit. I think about how often clients come in and they're subclinical, like you don't meet full criteria for this or this or this. And what does it mean for us to be able to say, but as a clinician, my hope is to still be able to see you as a whole person and say this, I know enough about this and enough about this, that perhaps this gives me some snapshot of what's going on for you, but you don't just fall into a box. And I think that's, at least for me, very humbling. And I think it takes some work in clinical situations to be able to say, like, we don't have a label. I don't actually know if your mom's a narcissist, but your mom does have some of these tendencies that make you feel belittled, that make you feel uncomfortable, that have actually been disrespectful to you. So we can talk about the function of those tendencies that we see. And that would be easier just to call your mom a narcissist. But I don't know your mom, never met her. I actually can't tell you that she's a narcissist very often, right? But what does it mean then to say that I think often behind this desire to label is this desire for meaning making, to make sense of our stories, to make sense, back to the question earlier about our narratives. Like, how do I make sense of what's happened? I don't think we always have to have a label to do that, but I think labels can be helpful. Whenever I do psychological testing, I think about the fact that if I have a diagnosis at the end of all the hours of testing, my hope is that the diagnosis I give fits the lived experience of the person. That's how I know it was successful, not because I scored everything properly, but because I say, this is what the report says. Does that match the last 20 years of your life? Does that match the last 6 months since you had your brain injury, that this is what you see? The point of the label is to help, I think, affirm what you already know, to give a word that affirms what you already know, as opposed to, now that you know the word, this is the prescription for who you are. No, that's not how labels are meant to work. And so I think it takes some courage in normal life to say, if I didn't use that particular term, but we talked about some of kind of the symptoms connected to it, might that also be helpful for meaning making without having to reduce someone down to a particular label?
Thank you for that. I want to raise something here that came in because I think it's an example of collective wisdom. This person tells a heartbreaking story of fasting and praying and writing a confrontation to a narcissistic pastor, first going alone, then going with witnesses, following sort of a biblical example, and it only blew up in their face and plummeted the person who was trying to approach the pastor into depression for several years. And this person says, it's so important to release and let go of any expectation or change or positive response when confronting a narcissist. We must confront, but not let the lack of response crush us. And there's something really humble in that. That's intellectual humility. And I really appreciate that. I think that's a good word for clinicians too. Back to the question about working with narcissists. I think if we can go in, and here's a phrase I like, and it has the word narcissistic in it. If therapists can non-narcissistically invest themselves in their patients, what that means is we invest in them, but we don't let the outcome of that impact our sense of self. Then I think we can enter into with more creativity, actually, with more openness, with even more courage, and sometimes with more confrontation when we need to. But we have to be able to let those treatments end, and end badly sometimes. Also, however, I would say the good news is I would almost anticipate that if I have a narcissist, I'm going to see them more than once. Because I'm not going to be surprised if we have a rupture that then they leave therapy, and I'm not surprised when they call back months later. So that doesn't always happen, but it sometimes happens.
I'm short.
Just take it off. Yeah, there you go.
Hi. So MDiv, So practically speaking, in the ministry sense, my context was a metropolitan area, New York City. Churches are usually the safety net for caring for those who are going through some mental health issues. And so many people come into the church. Is there a way to safely manage this type of personality? Because of course I would love to say you cannot come back to this church, you are causing damage. But then again, that is to say that every person that presents these attributes are these bizarre and extreme examples. So let's say a person comes to me or we notice someone with these traits. How do we manage and also safely take care of our flock as well, but also addressing that, oh, this might not be the most healthy place for them to be in, but knowing your limits, but also understanding like socially, they might not have access, and that's why they come into the church. So.
Well, this may or may not be a direct answer, but I do want to say this because your question is raising this for me. Whatever the mental health issue is, I think that pastors need to work in teams. There needs to be groups of people, and sometimes groups of people assigned to particular people, whether it's someone with a psychotic disorder or a very disruptive personality disorder. For that to fall only on the desk of the pastor is too much. So pastors, you need to be developers of people. And so find the people who have natural tendencies and proclivities toward helping others in healthy ways, and see if you can begin to train them and put them together so that when there's someone who needs some special help or care, it doesn't fall on one person. And so that group could come around someone who's disruptive or creating dissension. Obviously, if they're putting people at danger, those kinds of things, that's a different level of intervention, I think. But if they're causing dissension or just distraction, how can you share that? How can you have people that can come around them and speak the truth to them? Like a pastor might have a pastoral care committee. Maybe some people need at least temporarily, a care committee of some kind. In the School of Psychology, we have student development committee. If someone's struggling, we want to come alongside them and help them with whatever, so they can get back to a level of functioning. Maybe there's some kinds of things that we could do there. But you're really speaking to the fact that, as we talk about church being a hospital for the sick, I mean, it should be messy, right? There should be, cigarette butts in the parking lot and stains on the carpet and the smell in the back three rows. I mean, or maybe we're really not doing it quite right.
I echo what you have said. I do. And I think to your point about kind of how do you discern if you kind of let someone stay in the congregation, I do think our desire is to make sure that all really are welcomed. And not just welcome when they look nice, but like they have a place to belong genuinely. And so I do think Dr. Strawn's points about safety are really important to pay attention to. But I think before we ever consider anyone exiting our congregation, there is the huge question of, has our structure changed to accommodate them? That feels really important to me. I remember once going to the movies with a friend who's also, I guess he wasn't a therapist, but we were going to the movies, and on our way back, we passed a woman who was unhoused, kind of just sitting on a bench. And I left, and my friend stayed and eventually texted me and was like, hey, can you help me figure out what to do with this particular woman who's gonna be out here all night? It's winter, it's Chicago, any thoughts? We both went into the same church and asked if our church had any recommendations, and thankfully we found an accommodation for that night. But we went to our pastor the next day, and he was like, well, we don't have any programming outside of what the city does kind of in this community. And I remember asking, if the back three rows really ought to be places where anyone, not just the back three rows, but if the back three rows are often where anyone might come in, what does it mean for our structure to have been considering them? And not just, there's the one time an unhoused woman walked in off the street. It's not usually in our suburb where that happens. What does it mean then to say that perhaps the call of the church really is to make sure that we are actually adjusting our systems, our structures to be able to accommodate them? And we start with that. And then if after the accommodation perhaps is not working as well, then perhaps we have to find some additional resources. Thank you for the question, Christin. I appreciate it.